Hello everyone, and welcome to our podcast series in the classical political economy tradition by the Vinson Centre for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. The Vinson Centre runs a series of programs in economics and related fields designed to promote a wider understanding of classical liberal economics and how markets, trade, and entrepreneurship promote welfare in a free society. I am Juan Castañeda, Director of the Vinson Centre, and today we'll be hosting Steve Davies. Steve Davies is Senior Education Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London and Senior Academic Fellow at the John Locke Institute. A historian, he attended St Andrews University and taught for 30 years at Manchester Metropolitan University. He has published several books on a range of topics, including The Wealth Explosion, The Nature and Origins of Modernity, The Streetwise Guide to the Devil and All His Works, and Apocalypse Next, The Economics of Global Catastrophic Risk. He has a forthcoming book on the theory of political realignment and how it explains political developments in much of the world since 2010. Today, we'll discuss different definitions of liberalism and what a classical liberal is with Dr. Steve Davies. Steve, we are delighted to have you with us. When discussing politics or economics, quite often we hear people referring to an individual in favor of free market policies as a liberal or a neoliberal, sometimes they say. Is there a substantial difference between the two terms?
Yes, there is, but it's not the one that many people often think. The term neoliberal was originally invented by academics as a critical term to apply to the free market turn that public policy had taken in the 1980s and 1990s. And originally, as it was used by people like, say, Naomi Klein, it just meant it's free market economics and I don't like it. It was a pejorative expression, and it was actually intended to convey more about the person using the word than about the person to whom it was applied. It was a way of signalling to your listener that you did not approve of the free market turn in public policy and you thought there should be a move in a more traditionally socialist direction. However, the academics then took up the term, and over the years, they've given it a more precise meaning. And there is a clear distinction between neoliberals and liberals more generally and classical liberals in particular. Now, what is that difference? Well, to understand, you have to, I think, be critical of some of the kind of historical accounts that you will get when people talk about this. The common account you will get is that neoliberalism is a turn towards markets in public policy, which began with Thatcher and Reagan at the end of the 1970s, and which then continued on thereafter and also took over parts of the left with people like Tony Blair, Gerhard Schroeder, the later François Mitterrand. Now, I think that's actually got one serious flaw in it, which is that actually in neoliberalism, as a coherent intellectual position and public policy position, actually appears at the very end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, around about the time of the collapse of communism. It's not actually what Thatcher and Reagan and the classical liberals around them in the early 1980s thought they were doing. Now, what happens is that neoliberalism arises on both the left and the right in the time I've just mentioned, the late 1980s, early 1990s. For the part of the left, it was indeed a response to the electoral success of Thatcher, Reagan and others like them, and also, of course, the collapse of communism and the perception that it was no longer possible to have either a state-controlled, traditionally socialist economy or even the kind of traditional social democracy in which you had very high levels of government spending, direct government interaction in the economy through things like state ownership of key industrial sectors or things of that sort. The conclusion that people on the left drew was that neither of those forms of socialism, classical social democracy or full-on socialism, communism, was feasible anymore. What really persuaded them of this was the experience of the Mitterrand government in 1981 to 1983, when François Mitterrand initially came in with a programme which he'd formally agreed with the Communist Party, remember, the so-called Common Programme, which involved classical classical radical social democracy, state ownership of the banking sector, state ownership of large parts of French industry, very large increase in French government spending, radical left-wing Keynesianism. And what happened was that in order to protect the franc, they were forced to abandon this policy because of the mass outflows of capital from France. And so the left concluded that in a world with floating exchange rates and free movements of capital, you could no longer follow the conventional left-wing program. And so they turned to something else. Meanwhile, at the end of the 1980s, the free market right, the classical liberals, who'd put through a big break with post-war Keynesianism in the early 1980s, things for them had not worked out quite the way they expected. And the big problem for them was that although they'd privatized industries and although they had tried to cut government spending had not shrunk. In fact, under both Reagan and Thatcher, it had increased both in absolute terms and as a share of GDP. And in America, Reagan had cut taxes dramatically, but all that had led to was massive deficits because the Congress, which was controlled by the Democrats, had still kept on pumping up the public spending. And so the right also had to rethink what it was doing. And they also converged on a very similar answer to the one that the left was coming up with. And what was that answer? This thing that we now call neoliberalism. Well, it was the idea that markets were not natural or spontaneous phenomena, which was the classical liberal position. So it wasn't simply a matter of reducing the size of government and then just leaving people to their own devices to interact with each other, which was the original classical liberal vision. Rather, the idea was that markets were deliberately designed, engineered processes or institutions which were created by technocratic governments in order to address social problems. So the idea was that you could do various things like addressing social problems, having greater equality, encouraging private investors to do certain things, but you use market mechanisms to do this. And so markets become, this is the key position of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the idea that you still want a big government, you still want government spending a lot of money and doing a lot of things, but it should try to deliver services through market forms, and it should try to use markets as designed implements to achieve collective ends. The best example of this, and I'll finish with that, is the way the left-wing view of taxation and increasingly the right-wing view of taxation changed. The classical socialist view of taxation is that taxation is a straightforward matter of taking money away from the rich and giving it directly to the poor through public spending of various kinds. That still persists, but the idea is now also that you use the tax system to create incentives to lead people to act in certain ways which will achieve certain social goals, such as being less environmentally damaging, for example, or more egalitarian in the terms of the way the outcomes that the market arrives at. This was very much, for example, Gordon Brown's view. And one of the problems with that in practice has been that it's made the tax system unbelievably complicated. And it turns it from being a straightforward instrument of government power into being a kind of nudging, manipulating, very complicated instrument. And so neoliberalism means a technocratic approach to politics, which sees politics as being essentially about the designing of solutions using market mechanisms which are created and produced not by spontaneous social action, but by experts, qualified experts, particularly economists, but not just them, which is a radically different vision from the original classical liberal vision of Thatcher and Reagan, which, as I say, had basically not produced the results people thought it would produce by the end of the 1980s.
So, on classical liberalism, which would be the fundamental principles that define a classical liberal?
Well, first of all, the thing that makes them liberals, and which they share with other kinds of liberals, social liberals, Rawlsian liberals, is the belief that individual liberty is the primary political good. Now, this is true for a Rawlsian liberal, because if you read Rawls's principle of justice, he says there are two principles. There's a liberty principle and then there's the difference principle, which he gets from his thought experiment. But he says very clearly, the liberty principle trumps the difference principle. So the action you need to take to address the difference principle would involve a violation of civil liberty, then you don't do it, basically. So the commitment to liberty is primary for all liberals. Why is it primary? Well, not as an end in itself. No one in their right mind thinks that liberty is an end in itself, but because liberty is seen as being essential and a core part of human flourishing in its widest possible diversity, as John Stuart Mill and Wilhem von Humboldt put it. And so the primary central commitment of liberals is to so organising and ordering society and human affairs that there will be the widest possible degree of human flourishing in its most diverse forms, with each individual basically pursuing their own life projects, realising their own life goals. And in order for this to happen, it's argued, and to have all the good things that go along with it, you need the maximal degree possible of human liberty. That's what all liberals think. What makes classical liberals distinctive is their belief that this necessarily involves a very restricted role for political power and for government. In the most extreme case, almost none. But most classical liberals think that although you may need to use political power and government power, you should do so on a very limited basis, only when there is really no better option or choice available to you, simply because government power inevitably involves the use of force, either explicitly or implicitly. That is what governments have that no private actor has. The most powerful corporation in the world does not dispose of deadly force with legal standing, which is what governments do. You know, in Max Weber's famous definition of the state, it's the institution that has a legal monopoly on the use of lethal force. Now, that's what distinguishes classical liberals from modern revisionist kinds of liberals, because revisionist liberals believe that you can use state action, and particularly redistribution of resources, to actually increase people's effective agency and increase their positive liberty. Whereas classical liberals think that actually that is very, very dangerous or even counterproductive, and that therefore you should have a very restricted role for the states. And so the really big division is over whether or not you have a welfare state. I think all kinds of liberals broadly agree that on liberty grounds and also consequentialist grounds, the best way of organising the economy is a broadly free market economy. The big difference between classical liberals and non-classical liberals is whether or not you have a large state welfare function.
Well, to make things more complicated, in the US, they use the term libertarian to refer to a free marketeer. A liberal in the US would be defending the opposite policies, as you know, those in favour of more government intervention in the economy. So which would be the main differences between a libertarian in the US and a classical liberal in Europe?
Well, as you said, the Americans very confusingly have a unique use of the word liberal to mean what in most of the world is called a social democrat. So the kind of people who are described or self-described as liberals in the US, a lot of them, or most of them, until fairly recently, would have been the kind of people that any European would recognise as a social democrat. So Barack Obama, for example, lots of Americans saying he was a far-left socialist, and any European would think, well, no, he's not that. We have those over here, and he's not one of them. But they would recognise him straightforwardly as a high government spending social democrat. Now, there are some liberals of the American sense who are also genuinely liberals. I would think of people like Alan Wolfe, for example, or Martha Nussbaum. They are essentially John Rawls kind liberals. They're social liberals who are broadly liberals, but they think that government action can help to promote liberty. Now, the trouble is that the term libertarian came to be used by American classical liberals as a way of describing themselves, which distinguished them from the revisionist liberals and or social democrats who had captured the term liberal, but which also distinguished them from conservatives. Now, what is an American conservative? That's another whole different issue, because American conservatism is, I would argue, very, very different from the conservatism of Europe, because of historical reasons. The United States has never had a monarchy, never had a hereditary aristocracy, never had an established church. It's never had any of the kind of historic institutions that give rise to the traditions of European conservatism. But on the other hand, it does have a kind of politics which has come to call itself conservative. And the classical liberals in America wanted to distinguish themselves from those kinds of conservatives. Unfortunately, this has become increasingly difficult for them to do. The term libertarian has become severely compromised in recent years because a lot of people who are not, in any sense, classical liberals have taken to calling themselves libertarians. This is something that began under the presidency of George W. Bush, and I think that means that now the term libertarian has also become severely compromised if you're a classical liberal and also an American. So what is the difference between an American classical liberal and an American conservative? Well, an American classical liberal is just a classical liberal of the kind I described a moment ago. An American conservative is somebody who espouses a tradition which you can find in American politics all the way back to the founding with people like Alexander Hamilton. And essentially it's a tradition which believes in a broadly free market economy, an economy in which productive assets are privately owned, but which thinks that government should have a very active role in that economy, mainly through protectionism, but also through deliberately promoting and encouraging certain industrial sectors through what we would call an industrial policy. And that's because for those kinds of American conservatives, the goal of economic life is not simply individual flourishing, it's national greatness and national power. And from the liberal point of view, that is completely wrong. An economy, a free economy, should just be individuals seeking their own self-interest, which will produce, according to Adam Smith's arguments, a collectively good outcome. There shouldn't be some overarching social goal, such as national power, or for that matter, equality or social justice, that is supposed to their structure and guide through political action the economic choices made by individuals. So that's the big difference, really. There are a number of other differences too, which have to do with cultural politics in the United States. American conservatives are typically people who think that the United States should be an explicitly Christian nation, which classical liberals reject. And also, of course, there's a very vexed question of racial politics in the United States. A lot of American conservatives are either implicitly or even increasingly explicitly in favour of a certain kind of racial orientation to policy, which classical liberals reject. Not full-on white supremacy anymore, not apart from in the wilder fringes of the internet, but certainly the idea that the United States should be an ethnic nation in which white Americans are the predominant and dominant ethnicity. And again, classical liberals would reject that because of their general scepticism about nationalism, which is one of the other features of that traditional theory.
And also, as you mentioned earlier, we can identify different political traditions within the liberal movement. For example, in a recent book published in 2023, Pax Economica, the historian William Palin reflects on the left-wing support of free trade in the 19th century. Could you comment on these other liberal movements from the left, if you like?
Well, I don't think these are other liberal movements, actually. One of the things to understand is that classical liberalism is historically on the left. So in the 19th century, as Mark Palin is discussing in his book, the cause of free trade and the other causes for which liberals advocated, such as secularization, anti-clericalism, big phenomena in the Spanish-speaking world, as you will know, but also very often land reform, free movement, the abolition of controls on people's movement. These are all seen as radical left ideas and radical left goals. And throughout the period up to really the 1920s or the aftermath of World War I, liberalism is seen as being a left-wing movement. And the classical liberals are seen both by their opponents, traditionalist conservatives, and by themselves as being on the left. They are the historic Now, they do distinguish themselves from what you might call the radical or Jacobin left, the kind of tradition of revolutionary left politics that goes back to Robespierre, Danton, Marat, and the radical phase of the French Revolution, and also from socialism. And socialists tend to look back to the Jacobins as their progenitors. But they still see themselves as being on the left. Now, in the course of the 20th century, what has happened is that because socialism emerged in the early 20th century as the main rival or interlocutor to, on one side of politics, the classical liberals two things happened to them. One was that liberals split into the two broad camps of social liberals, revisionist liberals, and the remaining classical liberals. And the other thing that happened was that the remaining classical liberals in particular tended to ally themselves with conservatives who had now given up on their original project of restoring the ancien regime and had reconciled themselves to modern capitalism, against the common threat of socialism. And this leads classical liberalism to be, if you like, rebadged or reoriented as the right. Now, a very important feature, I think, of the way politics is developing is that we're in many ways seeing a reversion to the 19th century division in politics, in which the real division is between a kind of novel right wing, which in many ways, however, is a reversion to the kind of conservatism that you got in the late 19th, early 20th century. And up against opponents like that, liberalism is clearly on the left. And so I think classical liberalism actually is the left in the 19th century. It becomes part of the anti-socialist side and therefore the right, if you will, in the course of the 20th century. But I think that right now, in going into the 21st century, it's once again becoming part of the left.
That's very interesting, Steve, because if anything, I always think of liberals, or classical liberals in particular, as disruptors to the system, rather than very, very much in opposition to conservatives.
Yes, very much so. I mean, you could say that ultimately, originally, when liberalism as a political doctrine first appeared, conservatives were their greatest interlocutors, their main opponents. This is particularly true in the Catholic parts of Europe, Italy, France, Spain, the Spanish world more generally, more complicated in England and the Anglophone world for various reasons. But they were always on the left, and they're the people who want change. They're the people who want to undo the old order and bring in a new order. What has confused things is the appearance of socialism, which in its modern form, by the way, is actually an invention of no other person than Bismarck. I mean, it is Bismarck who creates modern state socialism, and he is the one who puts into the socialist mindset the idea that state power is the way to achieve socialist ends. He says in one of his Reichstag speeches that, state socialism is the wave of the future, and whoever controls it will, be in power. And he went on saying, I intend that to be me and people like me, typical Bismarck frankness, But that I think is very true, yes.
Well, the Spanish economist and indeed a classical liberal, Pedro Schwartz, said some time ago that in the Spain of the 1960s, of course a dictatorship at the time by Franco, all liberals fit in a Fiat 500, he said.
Yes.
I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I don't see classical liberals are on the rise in Western societies in the last few decades. What do you think?
Well, I'm actually more optimistic than Pedro is, because for the following reason. I think that I have a materialist account of history and ideas. I think that ultimately ideas and ideologies are the way people make sense of the social consciousness that is produced by material experience. And so I think that material experience, material ways of living, are what shape people's view of the world, their social consciousness, if you will, and then they use ideas to make sense of it. Now, classical liberalism historically grew out of a particular kind of social experience. One of the reasons why I think it went into decline over the course of the 20th century was that we entered into an era where the very experience of lived life for most people was one which was highly standardized and produced a kind of collective mass consciousness, if you will, in which a political philosophy that emphasized individuality and individualism became simply, it just made less and less sense to more and more people, because that kind of argument no longer resonated with their own concrete lived experience. Now, what I think is going on at the moment is two things. We are seeing, first of all, a move away from the kind of mass production, mass society that the 20th century created, from Fordism, as some people call it. And we're seeing in many ways a kind of ways of living and ways of experiencing life which once again resonate with or lead people to view the world much more individualistically, much more as a matter of their personal life project, for example. At the same time, we're seeing a reaction against this. This is what is driving the emergence of what I call national collectivist politics, the politics of people like Trump, for example. And it's so we're seeing the kind of an attempt to recreate or to hang on to certain forms of collective shared experience and identity. Now, what this doesn't mean that therefore people are going to spontaneously become classical liberals and start rediscovering Adam Smith. What classical liberals have to do, if you will, is to develop their own arguments and to put them out there in the public realm so that people who have had that particular physical experience read the classical liberal arguments or come across them in some format and say, oh, yes, that makes sense. That is, the way I feel. That's how my life is. That's how the world, as I understand it, is. And so partly this might indeed be a matter of putting classical works more into people's hands, so that somebody reads, the great classical liberal thinkers of the past, Mises or Smith or Mill, and then thinks, oh yes, right, I get it. But it also, I think, has to be restated. It's no good simply using the same version of timeless truths. You have to rephrase and redevelop timeless truths for each particular age. But I do think that the material circumstances of life now pose both a challenge for classical liberals, because they're giving rise to this reaction against them, which is producing a very strongly anti-liberal politics across the whole of Europe, but also provide an opportunity, a kind of cultural and institutional structure for liberalism that was lacking, really, I think, for a large part of the 20th century. And I think the nadir for the liberalism was the 1940s and early 50s in the UK, probably the 1960s in the very latter part of Franco's era in Spain, which is what Pedro's alluding to. So there's a different nadir in each country. The only real exception is France, where Friedrich Hayek said that France was the most hopeless country as far as liberalism was concerned, which is very sad given the great history of French liberalism. But you can see what he meant when you look at the various surveys.
So we need to make the case for classical liberalism. That's what we're trying to do from the Vinson Center, indeed from the IEA as well. Yeah. So for anyone interested in these topics, which authors or books would you recommend? If only a few of them.
Well, it is in terms of the classics, it is worth reading John Stuart Mill's little book on liberty, and also the book that really influenced him to write that, the also short book by Wilhem von Humboldt. It's got various titles in English. It's sometimes called The Sphere and Duties of Government, and it has other titles as well, but it's about the only book he published. Wonderful book, and in many ways clearer and less qualified than Mill. So I would recommend them. In terms of more contemporary works, there are various books. There are several histories of liberalism which are very good. Fletcher's History of Liberalism is very good. And there's a book which has come out very recently about liberalism as a way of life, which I think is very important and which is well worth reading.
Thank you very much, Steve, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you all very much for listening. This podcast is edited by the Vinson Center at the University of Buckingham. You can visit our website at vinsoncentre.com to access our podcast series and know more about the programs and events we host, both in Buckingham and in London. Please subscribe to our newsletter if you want to receive timely information on the Vinson Center's agenda.